I was going to be one of those YouTubers who drinks tea in their videos, but it took me so long to like set up the camera and everything that it's gone cold, so like now I need to down it. Today I am going to talk about the books that I read in summer. Technically these are the books I read in January and February, so obviously missing out 1 month of summer, but calling it a summer read sounds fun, so that's what I'm going to do. I have been on a reading streak compared to the amount I was reading last year. I've already read 5 books this year, which I'm very pleased with. It just goes to show that when you decide to actually sit down and read, you can get through quite a few books. The first book I read this year was The Pisces by Broder. I read Milk Fed by her last year and loved it so much, and annoyingly my library did not have this book, which I found quite surprising considering this one got huge amounts of hype when it came out. So I asked for this one for Christmas, and to be honest, reading it and thinking about the fact that my mum bought this for me was probably a little bit weird. I probably should have thought about that, knowing how graphically sexual Broder likes to be in her books. I have to say though, I didn't enjoy this one as much as Milk Fed, which is a bit sad and means I now have a copy of this book that I don't really want to keep. It just goes to show that libraries should have all the books that I want to read, clearly. This is about a woman called Lucy, probably another reason why I was interested in reading it, to be honest. The story kind of starts off with her breaking up with a fairly long-term partner and having a bit of a crisis as a result, and she goes and stays in her sister's house to look after her dog while she's overseas. Her sister's house is by the beach somewhere in California, I think it was, and one night while she's sitting on the rocks, she meets a swimmer and sort of strikes up a relationship with him. The whole book is basically about women who feel very dependent on being in relationships for their sense of self-worth. The character of Lucy goes to like a meeting with other women who also sort of feel the same way, though she struggles to recognize this aspect about herself and thinks they're all crazy while she's the sane one. I found it quite difficult to relate to this character because I'm pretty much the opposite of that, so I didn't feel a lot of sympathy with her. I honestly thought she should just get a grip and get herself together and stop worrying about what men thought about her, so it did make it hard to enjoy. So I think I can mainly just say that this book was just not for me. I also just thought it was super repetitive in the way it was written. I think she really struggled to fill out a whole story with what she was trying to say, and I also thought that it was very thematic in a really obvious way. It almost felt like she'd thought up these themes that she'd wanted to write about first and then found a story to fit them. It definitely reads very well. She's a very talented writer, obviously, and it's a very competent book, but I think it just left a lot to be desired, especially because I thought her second book was so amazing. Next I read Another Present. This is something I asked for my birthday because again the library does not have a copy of this book. This is On Writing a Memoir of the Craft by Stephen King. I've only read one Stephen King novel, Carrie, which I did really enjoy, and I have been meaning to read some of his other books, I just haven't got around to it. But I just heard that this was the best book about writing. I'm not necessarily interested in reading books about writing because I do believe that the best way to learn how to write is to read books and then write stuff. And that's kind of what Stephen King himself says as well. But I am interested in what actually successful writers have to say about writing. And all the reviews are true. This is a really good book. It is part a memoir. So the beginning part of it is about his life, is about how he grew up, his family, and the things along the way that kind of led him to the career that he has now. Not in any huge detail in that I don't think he goes into anything super personal, but there's definitely some personal aspects in it that are really interesting to learn about. And then the second half of the book is his actual tips about writing. He has such an easy way of writing, as if you're just having a conversation with him. It makes it so easy to read. But I also loved it because I pretty much 100% agree with all of the tips that he said. He's a real practical person when it comes to writing, which is probably quite evident from his novels and the types of books that he writes anyway. He grew up watching horror films, sort of Hammer horror films, I think. So for him, storytelling came from the cinema, not so much reading, though of course he also loves to read. But the idea of actually writing, he was almost forced into it at school because the teachers clearly recognized that he was talented at it, and so they sort of pushed him into doing an internship kind of thing at a local newspaper. And I always say journalism is the best place to learn how to write because there's no room for anything extra. You have to tell the story as simply and easily as possible because you're trying to communicate information to as broad an audience as possible. And I'm not saying that you should do that when you're writing novels, but it is the perfect place to learn the basic skills of how to write, from which you can expand on to create something a bit more novel-like. One thing that he said just made me so happy because it was something that I'd actually already thought of myself, and I thought I was very clever for thinking it as well. So to have Stephen King also say this thing made me feel very justified in my theories about writing, in that he says that people always ask him, you know, where do your ideas come from? How do you create these kinds of stories? And he says that he strongly believes that writing stories is like discovering fossils, and that it's not creating so much as it is uncovering the story. And for him, it starts off with an idea or two ideas that you might not think go together, which makes them interesting when you do put them together. Usually a character and a situation, and then he just writes. He just goes from there. He doesn't plan anything out, because he strongly believes the story will reveal itself if you just write it, that the writer is a facilitator for the story. And that is something that I've sort of thought about before, and that to me, when I was writing fiction, that it was like uncovering a mosaic. It's like, you know, there's a full picture there somewhere underneath all the dirt. You just have to dust it away to discover it, which sounds super wanky, but like, it's just true. Like, when you try and write fiction, you're not coming up with it. It just appears in your head when you think about it enough. It's kind of insane, really. So anyway, yeah, that made me really happy that Stephen King also thought that way, and made me feel like I'm not so crazy. I would so highly recommend this book if you are thinking about doing any kind of writing, really, but especially fiction writing, obviously. And even if you're not a Stephen King fan, he just clearly knows what he's talking about with the quality and the volume of novels that he's created over the like many years that he's been writing. Next, I decided to read Summer Crossing by Truman Capote, purely because it has the word summer in the title. I found this book in an op shop, and I've not read a huge amount of Truman Capote, so I thought I would just pick it up. I actually haven't read In Cold Blood yet. I've read Breakfast at Tiffany's. This is actually an unpublished story, unpublished in his lifetime and discovered by his lawyer. It's about a girl called Grady O'Neill. I assume it's kind of set in the 50s sort of era, maybe 40s. She's sort of a socialite who doesn't really fit in with her family. Her family go away for the summer and she stays in New York, and slowly revealed that she is in a relationship with someone very much from the lower classes. It's set over a really short space of time. It felt very similar to like an F. Scott Fitzgerald novel, where you don't really feel like anything much is happening, but then something like super dramatic will happen. But really, it's more about interrogating the characters than anything else. I thought it was okay. There was nothing hugely interesting or unique about it, but definitely like a competent novel that feels like an American novel from that era. There are things that like the male character says that are quite racist, which was obviously uncomfortable to read. Because he's the only character who says those things, I'm assuming that Truman Capote is using it to reveal an aspect of this character, but it doesn't make it any less uncomfortable to read something like that. But yeah, other than that, I'm not sure I'd necessarily recommend it. It probably wasn't worth publishing, to be honest. It just made me more curious to read In Cold Blood, because I obviously want to read like the best work of Truman Capote. Next, I read People Like Her by Ellery Lloyd. I actually sort of finished it off. I'd started this last year and just kind of put it down because I was reading other things. This is a book I got from a sale at work, so it was only $2, and so I thought, why not? I'll give it a go. And it was actually super fun. I would kind of recommend it if you're in the mood for something really easy to read, like commercial fiction style, but actually kind of insightful in a way as well. So it's about a woman called Emmy Jackson, who is an Insta mum. She is a mum influencer on Instagram, has a huge following, like gets all these brand deals, free things all the time. The book switches different chapters between her point of view and her husband's point of view, who is an author who's written like one famous novel and never written anything else. And then you also get these other chapters from an unknown person who is clearly stalking Emmy. And so obviously the build is like a thriller, but in actual fact it doesn't really become a thriller until like the very end. It really is mostly a domestic drama about what it's like to be an influencer, how much hard work goes into it, how like corrupting it can be when you are using your children for profit, and the different way that different characters respond to Emmy's success. I definitely thought the thriller stuff was the weakest aspect of the book, but it was kind of fun in the end, I guess, because it was so silly and over the top. I thought the rest of the book was very well written, really held up by how well the characters are written, I think. But then saying that, the thriller side does have a point to it. I don't want to spoil it, but it talks about how dangerous taking advice from influencers can be. It becomes especially murky when you are being like a mother sharing her experiences online. When Emmy gets to the point where she shares things that didn't actually happen to her just to sort of have some content, have something to say, and in the book that has real serious consequences to one of her followers. So that aspect was quite interesting. A lot of books about the internet I feel are so clunky, but this is probably the most realistic portrayal I've seen of like people using Instagram and social media in a novel. It was quite good, and I am glad that I bought it. The last book I finished was Late Bloomer by Clem Bastow. This is a memoir about the author's experience with being diagnosed with autism at the age of 36, I think it was, and it's basically her looking back at her childhood and looking at all the aspects of her life which she can now clearly relate to autism. I enjoyed this so much. She's an Australian author, and she was actually on the show Hard Quiz the other night, which such a coincidence. Makes sense though, that show is all about like knowing a lot of things in your special subject, and she talks quite a lot about the fact that she has this uncanny ability to remember just reams of dialogue from films. Very helpful when you're trying to answer questions in a quiz about E.T., which was her special subject. Over the last probably couple of years, I've come to think that I'm probably most likely autistic. It's not something I feel comfortable talking about in great detail simply because I'm not diagnosed, and part of that is because doctors make me feel so anxious. Just the thought of going to the doctor makes me anxious, so I haven't even looked into trying to get a diagnosis, even though I'd really love to. It's also difficult to talk about because there's still so many misconceptions about what autistic people look like. I think slowly we're getting there, but it's kind of more only if you're someone who's like specifically googled autism rather than like the general public. So hopefully books like these are helping to expand people's ideas of what autism looks like, because especially in women it often goes undiagnosed because women are taught that they have to be social creatures, and so they become quite adept at masking all the traits that make them stand out. For me, reading this book, I didn't have an exact same experience as Clem, but definitely a lot of similar things. Even just a small thing like the fact that she has a dyscalculia, I think that's how you say it, which is like dyslexia but for numbers, and my whole life I've been unable to do any kind of maths that involve numbers. Like algebra, easy because it's logic and it involves letters, but anything just simple mathematics I cannot do unless I'm like counting on my fingers. And she's exactly the same, and apparently that is a super common thing when it comes to autism, which is interesting considering that the stereotypical idea we have of a person with autism is like a man who has no social skills but is really good at maths. The main takeaway though is that she just felt, especially when she was at school, that she did not fit in with her peers. There was just some barrier there that she could never quite understand, and I felt exactly the same way. I could make a whole separate video on the many things that I related to when reading this. This book has certainly been very helpful to me in terms of confirming even more my suspicions about where I fit in the neurodivergent spectrum. Regardless of whether you're autistic or not, I think this book is so interesting, so helpful, so good at just learning about something that has been so misunderstood for so long and so stereotyped for so long. Also has such a pretty sparkly cover, so how could you resist that? Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a great day, and I will see you soon. Bye!